Hi folks, my name's Jem, I'm the Crazy Pigeon Lady, and it's my mission to entertain, educate and inspire people with all things pigeon and dove. I'm making this video for World Book Day, which is a festival that celebrates the power of books, of reading and of honouring their writers. And books have been incredibly important to my education as a Crazy Pigeon Lady, and I actually have a small library of books about pigeons and doves of all kinds from which I've gained and owe much of my knowledge. So I thought I'd make this little video, just give you a whistle-stop tour to a small selection from my library. So here are my top 5 pigeon and dove related books. So coming in at number 5 we have this book here, Berthia and the Racing Pigeon by Pam Ayres. This is actually a storybook, ostensibly for children, although I actually think it's a great storyline and I certainly enjoyed it enormously when I read it. And it tells the story of Berthia, who is a wild wood pigeon, who comes across Fleet, a racing pigeon who has become lost whilst on a race, and he's injured. So she gets together with him and nurses him back to health, and they eventually fall in love and decide to make a nest together. However, Fleet is kidnapped by some grubby-handed kidnappers who want to get a reward from his owner, and they think that there's some money in it for them, so they pop him on a train, and there begins a long ripping yarn to get Fleet back to Berthia before their chicks hatch. And they have their nest sat on by a local friendly owl. It's a great story, full of humour and interesting characters. I actually think it would be an excellent story for adapting into an animated movie. So if there's anyone out there that does that, please pick up this book and make a pigeon-related animation. I would love that enormously. So that's Berthia the Racing Pigeon by Pam Ayres, a British writer, actually most well known for her poetry, but also has written some books too. So that's my number 5, Berthia and the Racing Pigeon, a lovely storybook that adults and children can both enjoy. So coming in at number 4 is this book here, which is a book I acquired relatively recently. So this is the Wood Pigeon by R.K. Merton, which is number 20 in the New Naturalists book series. This is an old book. This was published in 1965, so a lot of the information in it is not necessarily current, in the sense that a lot has changed, certainly in our ecology and the size of the pigeon population and agricultural practices since this book was written. But much of it is still relevant about the species, and I'm not actually aware of any other book written in English that is specifically about the Eurasian wood pigeon, Columba palumba. So it pleases me greatly that there is a book out there specifically about this species. It's a very geeky book. It's not necessarily an easy read, so it's full of lots of facts, figures, statistics, charts, data. Much of the information in this book has been collected through field study. I find that extremely interesting. And there's lots of analysis there about it. So it was a fascinating read for me. It is quite a geeky read. You do have to be quite dedicated to it. But I know of no other work in existence on the Eurasian wood pigeon of a similar level of detail and interest. And I certainly found out a couple of new things that I didn't know about the species when I read it. So if anyone else does know of another book out there in English about the Eurasian wood pigeon that's perhaps more up to date, I would love to hear about it. So please pop that in the comments if you are aware of such a publication. So that's my number 4, The Wood Pigeon by R.K. Merton, number 20 in the New Naturalist series, published by Collins. Moving on to number 3, we have this book here, A Feathered River Across the Sky, written by American author Joel Greenberg. Now this is about the passenger pigeon, Ectopistes migratorius, which is a species that was native to North America and became extinct in the early 20th century. Now there are a lot of books out there about the passenger pigeon, and in fact there was a flurry of books published in the wake of the 100th anniversary of the passing of Martha, the very last passenger pigeon, back in 2014, which was the 100th anniversary of her passing. And this is one of those books, and I have a number of others. Perhaps the most seminal work about the passenger pigeon is actually the work by Schorger, which was written in the 1950s, which collated all of the available literature that existed about the passenger pigeon at the time, and he reviewed over 10,000 individual pieces of documentation to put together his book, which was the first comprehensive work about the passenger pigeon, despite the fact that it had died some decades earlier. However, the Schorger book is itself not a particularly easy read. It is essentially an extensive literature review, and while it is an incredibly important reference book for any writing about the passenger pigeon, it isn't a great read from start to finish. It's quite heavy and got lots of information. However, this book approaches the story of the passenger pigeon from a much more historical context, and compared to some of the other books I've read, I have to say this is incredibly well researched from a historical point of view, and Joel has dug up lots and lots of historical information that really illuminates and brings to life the story of the passenger pigeon and its demise. I actually have another book called A Message from Martha that was published in the same year, and actually reading the two together is an interesting contrast. A Message from Martha is actually written by a British ecologist who went on a road trip across the States to visit various sites related to the passenger pigeon, and it's interesting to compare his writing to this one because he comes at the passenger pigeon story from quite a different angle. And whilst the most emotive elements of the passenger pigeon story are that of its hunting, the conclusion of the ecologist was actually that the habitat destruction played a larger role than hunting in the demise of the passenger pigeon. There's actually a great YouTube video out there with some presentation about some modelling data that shows this to be the case. However, this focuses much more on the history rather than the ecology of the bird, and there is perhaps an emphasis on the emotive aspects of its story, like the hunting, etc. So I don't think it necessarily represents a balanced view of the demise of the passenger pigeon, but it is incredibly well researched, as I said before, and it is a very, very good and interesting read, and provides a real insight into the lives of people and their relationship to the passenger pigeon in its time. So that's my number 3 book, A Feathered River Across the Sky by Joel Greenberg. Moving on to number 2, Pigeons, A Complete Pet Owner's Manual. This is by Pigeons and Erskine. Now, this is the only book that I am aware of that is specifically about keeping pigeons as pets as such. There are books out there that are about pigeon husbandry, so more geared towards breeding, either for showing or racing, but this is the only book I'm aware of that's really geared up towards keeping pigeons as pets. It was the first pigeon book that I ever owned, and it provided much of the information that helped me get started with keeping pigeons as pets. And whilst I don't think it's a perfect book, and I think there's definitely a gap in the market there to produce a better book for keeping pigeons as pets, particularly keeping pigeons as pets indoors rather than outdoors, as is described in this book. There's definitely a gap in the market there for a book of that nature. But until such a book exists, then this is a great book to get you started. That, and of course my Pigeons as Pets Beginner's Guide series, which I'd love you to check out on the Pigeons as Pets playlist on the channel. So that's my number 2 book, Pigeons, A Pet Owner's Manual by Pigeons and Erskine. So finally, that brings me to my number 1 Pigeon and Dove book, and this is this book here, Pigeons and Doves, A Guide to the Pigeons and Doves of the World by Eustace Barnes and Cox. This is absolutely my favourite book in my Pigeons and Doves library. This is the granddaddy of all books about pigeons and doves. So as you can see, it's a pretty thick text. It's pretty weighty. It's also quite expensive. The retail price of this book is £65. So it's quite an investment if you want to have this book in your collection. But I do think it is absolutely worth it, because it is the only recent and up-to-date work in existence that covers the whole of the Columbidae. And not only are every single extant species described in this book, there are also colour illustrations of every single species as well, and a small handful of recent extinctions, including the passenger pigeon. There's also a section on the pigeon's relationship to the extinct dodo and solitaires birds. Prior to the publication of this book, probably the most recent work that's comparable in any way is actually one of the books behind me that you can't quite see, which is Pigeons and Doves of the World by the British author Derek Goodwin. And the most recent of that book, edition of that book is the third edition that was published back in 1982. And this edition that I've got here is published in 2000, although there is a slightly more recent version in a digital copy only from 2010. I thoroughly recommend this book. There are some beautiful pictures in this book. There are lots and lots of colour plates with illustrations that show all of the birds grouped by their taxonomic classification. So it actually provides a useful way to compare and contrast similar looking species. And if you're into pigeons and doves but perhaps weren't terribly familiar with exotic pigeons and doves around the world, it's a fantastic tour through just the sheer variety that exists out there amongst pigeon and doves, and not least the huge amount of colours and patterns that there are. We tend to think of pigeons and doves as being quite dull looking birds, you know, lots of greys and browns and things, but actually there is a huge amount of variety there. So if you love your pigeons and doves in general and you want a single book that has every species in it that currently exists, with beautiful illustrations and well-researched text based on the very latest information that we have available about these birds, then I thoroughly recommend investing in this book. So that's my #1 Pigeon and Doves book from my library. So that's Pigeons and Doves, A Guide to the Pigeons and Doves of the World by Gibbs, Barnes and Cox. So that's my top 5 favourite pigeon and dove books from my library. If you have a favourite book about pigeons or doves, whether it's fiction, non-fiction, children's books for adults, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. I'd also love to hear about any books that perhaps I'm not aware of. I'm always keen to find more books about pigeons and doves. I hope that's been of interest to you. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so that you can be the next to hear about my next Crazy Pigeon Lady video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye!